Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to another edition of Shochu'sday. Happy Shochu'sday. Happy good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, wherever you happen to be in the world. How you doing, Steven?
I'm good. I'm excited to finally have us back in the same place and be able to talk shop a little bit, which we haven't
Right?
haven't had too many chances to do recently.
Yeah, I
So
know. It's like only
yeah,
once over the past several months, or twice in a couple of months. But yeah, we've
yeah,
been running all over the shop, and one or the other of us having to take a break, and for whatever reason. But yeah, back at it. Number 105? No, 105, episode
yep,
105.
yeah, yeah.
And we much, kind of keeping in line with our recent travels and everything. The main theme today is a travel theme as well.
That's
Um,
right.
but before we get there, I guess, do we want to go through any booze news? And we're putting ourselves on the spot as usual because this requires thought.
That's right. Well, I think the exciting thing that I've got on the booze news front that's front of mind for me is there are actually not one but two shochu talks at Bar Convent Brooklyn this year, which
Hmm.
is pretty cool. One is sponsored by JSS, the Japanese Sake and Shochu Makers Association, with Don Lee, who's a cocktail consultant. He's going to be talking about how to play with high versus low proof shochu in cocktails. Obviously, when you have a 25% spirit versus a 35 or 40% spirit, the ratios have to change for you to get the right
Mhm.
body and mouthfeel and flavors and aromas in the cocktails. So that should be a really cool talk. And the other is actually our friend Monica Samuels, Julia Momose, and a third gentleman. Well, he's the only gentleman whose name I'm not remembering right now. They're talking about umami how umami in sake and shochu can add something to drinks, which I
Hmm.
think should also be a very cool seminar at Bar Convent Brooklyn, which this year will be in Industry City. It's a trade show, so if you're not actually in the trade, tickets might be a little difficult to acquire, but maybe not impossible if you can figure out some connection. If you got a friend who's a bartender, they might be able to sneak you
Vouch
in
for you.
if you
Yeah,
happen to
sneak you in.
happen to be
What
there.
are the
When
dates on that? I think it's June 15, 16. Is that right?
I think you're right. Yeah, it's in June. It was in August last year, but they moved up to June and they moved locations. It was at the Brooklyn Expo, and this year it's at Industry City, which should be pretty cool because you've got Brooklyn Kura right there. You've got Kuraichi, the the Japan specialty sake shop or spirits as well. Has pretty great selection of Japanese booze generally,
Yep.
and you've got the izakaya in Japan Village, basically all the shopping and dining that's
There's also the
available.
bar too, right? Oldies, which
That's
is a
right.
good option for Japanese spirits.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yes, I think folks who have an opportunity to be in New York in mid June, there's a chance there to see some pretty cool stuff if you manage
Just
to get
don't
it.
walk there.
Yeah, no, that's a hike.
When I went there last time, I walked from I was up a little bit further north in Brooklyn doing a couple of account visits, and then I walked probably a good 40 minutes south, down to Industry City, and it's not a particularly nice walk.
No,
It's
that's a pretty
incredibly
industrial.
it's incredibly
Yeah,
industrial, very dusty.
yeah,
I was constantly like doing this while I was walking because there was just dust swirling in the air. And then all of a
yeah,
sudden you come to this oasis of activity and kind of civilization when you get to City.
yeah.
It kind
If
of
you
wakes up all of a
imagine
sudden.
those old like mob movies from New York where they're driving through industrial parks and warehouses and that sort of thing, like you wonder where they filmed those. Basically, north of Industry City.
Yeah,
That's
no,
where
it makes
a lot of that
sense.
shooting is done because there's nothing there. So, I
Yeah,
mean, nothing
yeah,
that you'd want to spend time at unless you're working there. But yeah.
yep.
Anyway, that's our booze news. I would say that's a pretty
Yeah, I
good
think that's good. Good
start.
thinking. We got Mark Carlson
Oop.
chimed in with what he's drinking today over on YouTube. He's drinking an awamori, which is very apt. Mark,
Oh, nice.
I don't know if you're reading our minds, but we're gonna get back to this in a little bit
We will be
later.
talking. Yeah,
Very
there's
nice choice.
a number of connections to Okinawa and Awamori in our conversation today.
That's
So
right.
that's cool. Yeah, good choice. Good choice. Zoe sends a solid, very solid Awamori for sure. If you can
Yeah.
track it down. Um, Yeah, I guess to kick this off, this is our main event. We had an inquiry from a woman who lives here in Fukuoka, who's turns out that she's related to the Kurose family. And that name might not mean much to you yet, but it probably will in the future. They were one of the predominant shochu guilds in Japan, and I think she had, if I understand correctly, she didn't even realize that she was related to them, because that's a pretty common name in Kyushu, family name. But she didn't even know that she was related directly to the guild until a few years ago. And then once she realized that, she's become quite the advocate and ambassador for the history and legacy of that family's contribution to shochu, especially, well, all throughout Kyushu, basically, right? And so we were invited by her and local television team to go and visit deep south Kagoshima. We were in about as far southwest as you can get and still be on Kyushu in Kagoshima. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right out there on that little horn.
Yeah, maybe to give people a sense of where we're talking about, I'll call up a map. But let's see. But yeah, Christopher, what was your? Do you have anything to add to sort of the introduction of our topic today?
Yeah, I remember that this whole journey down to the southwestern tip of Kagoshima proper kind of evolved out of a recognition that Stephen and I both knew what Kurose Toji are and were, but were very interested in learning more. And Ms. Kurose herself was tickled by that fact, and decided to put together a trip where we could go and actually talk to a couple different generations of Kurose Toji. So we all bundled into a tiny little car and
It was a very
made
small
the trek up over the mountains over to the southwest. And it was that's kind of the genesis of that story. And yes, the camera crew showed up in order to document all of this, because we had a couple of weirdos going to class was going to be in session. So
That's right. That's right.
You got the map?
I do. Let me
Figure out how to share. It's always a little
always
more
should
complicated.
Be easier than it is. Okay. Now this is going to be in Japanese.
If you're listening, you need to make this sharing thing easier. Shouldn't be so
I apologize. This map is in Japanese. This is Tokyo, just as orangey. This is Japan, obviously. South Korea is here. Okinawa down here. Taiwan, mainland China, just to orient you. And so Christopher's based in Tokyo. I am based in Fukuoka, which is right up here. And we were right down here. So this little...
For me, it's under the banner.
Oh, okay, sorry. So here's Kyushu. So here's Fukuoka right up here. And then right down here, this is Kagoshima Prefecture. This area, Kagoshima City, is right here. And we drove from there way out to this peninsula. And we were on the southern coast of this peninsula to visit Toji no Sato Kasasa. So Kasasa is the name of the town where this distillery and where this Toji guild... Well, there's a distillery there that has a museum about the Kurose Toji. And then they're carrying on the legacy of the style. But it was a pretty deep journey out into the countryside. In fact, you can judge, I think, how rural. So this is sort of the area. You can judge how rural Japan is by how far you are from a convenience store. And when you get far enough away from a convenience store, there start to be public toilets available. So we passed a public toilet available in a fire station, which I don't think I've ever seen before.
No, that was a first for me as well.
Yeah. So it's right around it was right in this area, right? I don't have the actual pin on this map, because otherwise you'd be seeing tons of pins everywhere. But it might.
It was further up the horn, actually.
Was it? Because I thought we could see this island across the... Is this a museum?
Yeah, I think it's... No. That's
No?
Oh, that's the... Oh, yeah, that's the art museum.
That's the art museum. Okay, so it's right across the street from the art museum, right?
I think so.
Zoom in a little more. It should appear. There it is.
There it is.
So here's our location. This is where we were. Let's see. Oh, that's a nice drone view of the distillery. And the Toji were there to play ground golf. The retired Toji.
That was a new thing for me. This ground golf thing was apparently it's all the rage, and they were only going to come and talk to us if the weather was nice. Meaning
That's right.
they were going to be able to get in a round of ground golf as well before coming to hang out with the weirdos being
Yeah.
pumped in from Kagoshima City. But just to summarize what this is all about, that for folks who are unfamiliar, Toji are master brewer distillers in the shochu industry and the awamori industry. And a long time ago, somebody had to teach, or somebody had to guide all of the fermentation and the distillation in the distilleries. It wasn't just something that people independently had expertise in. This was actually something where there was ostensibly a village of people who spread these traditions throughout Kyushu. And so it's almost like a rent-a-pro. You are essentially renting one of these people to come up during the distilling season to run everything and guide everyone and make sure that the product comes out the way that you intend it. And they worked off of the same basic principles. They forged probably their own relationships, and Stephen can get into this a little bit more. But the Kurose Toji group, and then alongside them, the Ata Toji, which was another town of Toji craftspeople not too far away from Kurose, they were peripatetic craftspeople, and they helped spread this distilling culture throughout Kyushu Island and even farther afield.
That's right. And what spurred all of this until the late 19th century, shochu was completely being made non-professionally by farmers and fishermen. It was basically their own local hooch that they were home distilling, and they were using the fermentation techniques that they were used to, which was essentially using yellow koji, as in sake fermentation, was predominant in shochu making in Kyushu until that time. And then there was a meeting of the minds between basically a master sake brewer and two members of the Kurose family who had actually been trained in how to make Okinawan awamori with black koji. And so the Kurose guild that rose out of this collaboration between these three men ended up introducing black koji fermentation to Kyushu, as we understand it, at least as the story is told by the Kurose Toji Museum. And so these basically they grew this guild. This is in the probably late 1880s, early 1890s when this guild starts to rise to prominence. And at their peak, they had 500-600 members, and they all lived in the same village, in that a tiny part of deep south Kagoshima, and they would travel during this basically and they're all farmers, right? So they'd farm their fields during the summer. They'd leave home in teams of, I believe, about 5 people. So you had the master and some assistants and some apprentices, and they'd go out to different distilleries and they would work in teams to run the production at different distilleries around Kyushu. And then they would all come home after the season was over, usually in early spring, and they'd have a big party. And they'd share each other's what they made that year, and they'd all get together and talk about their season. But it sounds like they weren't very collaborative, or they weren't very open with information. So they were very secretive, even with each other. And so once a master figured something out, he wasn't going to tell others because he wanted to keep that secret. And so his assistants would kind of learn by watching, without being explicitly taught how to do it. And then they would carry on the next generation. And how many generations did there end up being through this? I think
I used that image for the featured image for this particular live stream. And I think there were like 5 generations. I think we're on to the 6th now, and
Hmm.
there's only like one guy left.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's in training right now to
Hmm.
continue this whole lineage of tradespeople, craftspeople, artisans, and it's very much, yeah. As Stephen was saying, this came about because finally the shochu production was taxed, it was regulated, and interestingly enough, that's also when women were largely kind of wedged out of the production process. It used to be a homemade product, and it was often women that were making it, and then it got taxed, and all of a sudden it became businesses, right, that were
Hmm.
being taxed on it, and then it became a very male driven endeavor. That all of the Kurose Toji are men,
Hmm.
and at least as far as I could tell, and they and the next generation who is in training is also a guy. Uh,
Hmm.
and so yeah, it was very much a fun. It's a relatively recent thing. These guilds of
Hmm.
craftspeople, and it's something that is dying out now.
Yep.
But they really were responsible for spreading the knowledge and the know-how to various reaches. I mean, as far north as Sanwa Shurui in Oita Prefecture, where they're making ichiko,
Hmm.
and then to all reaches. I think I saw there was one distillery named out on Iki Island, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken,
Hmm. Yep.
and everywhere else in between. So you've really
Yeah, and
got
even
them just like fanning out.
yeah, and even into uh, Honshu and Shikoku as well. I believe there were some
Yeah.
distilleries even that far afield. There was very few, but so most of it was concentrated in Kyushu. But a lot of distilleries that we know and love today had Kurose Toji running the show back in the day.
Yeah.
And it's
True.
interesting because I think the guild structure really rose out of what was. Um, I was just trying to think about it historically. Japan was a very cooperative country. You basically had it was an island nation, isolated from the world, lots of bad weather, lots of, earthquakes and all sorts of potential ecologic devastation that you were constantly facing. So there's definitely a sense of cooperation among the people to survive, right? And as they modernized through the Meiji Restoration, it makes sense that they would gather into guilds to try to figure out how to solve these new business challenges, which was, as we were saying, was a home distillate, and then became professionalized, and they weren't allowed to distill at home anymore.
Hmm.
So they figured out how can we do this right, and they got together and created these guilds. But then, almost as quickly as they started, just within a few generations, they essentially were relegated obsolete due to technological advancements. You
Yeah.
go into a modern shochu distillery now, and Sanwa Shirui is a great example. There are computer panels everywhere. There are very few people involved in hands-on production
Hmm.
relative to the volumes of spirit that they're making.
Yeah.
Uh, and in further reflection, I realized that with the people that we know that are actually carrying on this tradition, they're doing it independently. They're
Hmm.
learning from each other, but it's in an informal way. You no longer have this hierarchy, right? In the Kurose Toji Guild, you had the top guy, and he told everyone else where to go,
Yep.
right? And it was very, very hierarchical. And today you have Yamato Zakura talking to Nakamura, talking to Manzen, and they're all
Yeah.
sharing ideas and sharing their experiences freely with each other because they are the vestiges of those handmade distilleries that are still doing things in the traditional way, but they're not affiliated with the Kurose Toji or the Atta Toji, which have actually now died out completely, if
Yeah.
I understand.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
That's what I understood as well.
yeah. And I guess what was so cool for us was that we got to meet a couple of these guys who had been active as early as the 1950s. And so this
Hmm.
is pre modern production techniques. And so they were really probably the last generation that was doing this stuff completely by hand before a lot of the automation came into play. And it was funny when we asked them what's changed. They said computers. That was
Yeah.
basically their answer.
It's all plug and play now. A lot of places.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's these two guys. What were they in their 80s? Probably
I think
at
so.
least.
Yeah.
Yeah. We couldn't get a straight answer from them about how old they were.
Well, you had the dueling problems of they just wanted to talk about what they wanted to talk about it, and when they talked about something, they were going to do it in the thickest Southern Kagoshima accent that I had ever heard, and I'm kind of getting used to it a little bit, but holy crap! So it's the type of thing where even people who speak Japanese at a native level are going to be thrown by a lot of what's being said, and so that was a challenge too. But it was also an honor and a once in a lifetime opportunity for Stephen and I to sit across the table from two different generations of Kurose Toji and just hit them with some questions. But yeah, like Stephen said, they often didn't really get around to answering what we were asking about. But then also they were like, yeah, it's just, things have changed, and now the Toji aren't as the centralized Toji or the collaborative Toji is no longer useful. And if you look at the modern at the various types of businesses that are out there, you do have some that are owner Toji. You do have some that are hired Toji, where the Toji has no equity in the business. Which is probably a little bit more like the days of old. But the owner Toji has really come in. The family Toji has come in, where it's all been brought in-house, essentially. And they have decided not to they don't need the guilds anymore. And if you go to most distilleries today, some of the automation is drum-like in terms of making koji. You got a gigantic, almost cement mixer-looking drum that will slowly roll as necessary and propagate the koji for you. You can steam the rice in there. Some of them you can propagate the koji in there. It does it all for you. And then other places still have the triangle shaped koji, the sankaku, the koji making beds, which still requires a lot of human intervention in terms of like kneading and raking. It's a gigantic bed of koji, rather than using the little trays. And then you have the traditional places like where Stephen goes and works every fall at Yamato Zakura, Manzen, Nakamura. Also, of course, Toji no Sato Kasasa does everything by hand as well. And these places are the ones that are using the traditional trays and not sleeping a whole lot at night. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting experience. And I still feel like I have a lot of questions that I want to ask. And I want to know more about the differences between Kurose Toji and Ata Toji. And that was something we could not get a straight answer on. But
when we asked, they said, don't know.
They basically said, I don't know if they really thought about Ata Toji all that much. And probably
sure.
as well. But I don't know, what were some of your biggest impressions from that meeting?
Well, I guess just another thing as to why it fell out of favor is I think when shochu was a regional, seasonal product, and it was only consumed locally, and it was vast majority of the production was consumed locally, and it was completely seasonal because you didn't have good temperature control in the distilleries to make it year round. Right. Or to store the grains and crops that you need to make it, that the production volumes weren't so high that you could afford to hire a full-time Toji, right? And that's why these guilds, I think, existed. But as the industry grew and as some of these distilleries got large enough, they could hire full-time people and no longer needed to use the guild. And I think that's also part of why it died out. That plus the automation, I think, was kind of a double-edged sword that brought the guild to. It's not irrelevant because the history is clearly important, and that there are a small number of people carrying on the traditions. But as you said, the next generation, there's basically one member of the Kurose family who's chosen to carry this on, and he'll be presumably the next Toji of Toji no Sato Kasasa. And we also met the current generation Toji, the guy who's running it now. And then we met the previous generation, which are these two retirees who came to play ground golf and hang out with the weirdos. So we actually were able to meet three generations. The conversation, though, that you described, it was the two old men speaking very heavy Satsuma dialect. And even the younger guy who's set to take over, sometimes he was confused.
He's like, huh? What did you just say?
It's his own native dialect, and yet he doesn't understand what they're saying sometimes. So
Yeah.
that was really interesting. And then I guess I was fascinated by how important this is. I mean, I've heard about the Kurose Toji for many years, but I didn't ever have a way to wrap my head around it to
Yeah.
actually be able to share it with others, right? And to realize that it was only relevant for about 100 years, and yet it's made I think, a massive impact on shochu production. The entire industry, I think, has been influenced by these guilds and
Absolutely.
their legacy,
Hmm.
and it's something that should be honored and respected and talked about and considered an important part of it. They introduced black koji, as I mentioned. They also they innovated through the professional sake maker who was part of the team that started the guild, the two-stage fermentation.
Hmm.
Before that, they were doing what's called donburi shikomi, which is basically everything goes into the pot at once,
Yeah.
and
A
you get a
lot more
much
like
cleaner
awamori.
fermentation. Yep, you get a much cleaner fermentation though if you can propagate that koji in its own environment in the primary fermentation and then add the main ingredient later. You get a much
You
better
stretch it out.
final product. Yep.
Much more deliberate fermentation. Yeah, and
Yeah,
we've
and so
had
that
Bill's question up here for a couple
yes.
minutes. I think we've already
Yep.
answered it,
Hmm.
but what do you? I think it's partly people do want to learn it, but now it's just that you don't have to outsource it anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are young people who are interested in doing this, but how they're learning now is they're going to one of these handmade distilleries,
Just go directly.
learning to do it there, and then they go and either open their own distillery or end up taking over one of the existing distilleries. And an example of that is we talked about Tatsumi, the eau de vie distiller
Hmm.
uh, in where Gifu or someplace like that. He's up in Kansai,
I
I
think you're
think.
right.
And he went to shochu distilleries to learn these methods for several years before he went out on his own and opened his own distillery.
Yeah.
Now he does it all by himself. And so you do
Hmm.
have people like that, and they are going back to learn the traditional methods and then branching out on their own.
Hmm.
Um, but then, for example, our friend Shinya Nakamura, his family owns the distillery, but they had a very well respected Toji who basically mentored him
Hmm.
and trained him to do what he can do today. So you do have young people who are continuing these traditions. It's just not being done through the guild structure.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yep.
the other thing that happened, though, which they did talk about with us, is that the young people flock to the cities, right? There's no money in being a rural traveling Toji. There's no money in being a farmer. At least there hasn't been. And so for young people who wanted a better life in developing Japan, you went to Osaka, you went to Tokyo, you went to
Yeah.
Fukuoka,
Yep.
right? You went to Kagoshima City, and
Hmm.
you got the lifetime employment was really attractive for the salaryman, right? So a lot of people just abandoned their potential family businesses to go do that for financial reasons, which is a rational choice, right?
Yeah.
You need a passion for what you're doing, or you need some level of financial security to make the other decision to stay and do the harder work,
Hmm.
right? And so that was the exception.
The youngest or the Toji in training that we met during the interview is also currently working at a seishu brewery in Saga.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
he's doing the same thing. He's going somewhere to really study fermentation, and then he's going to come back and eventually take over. I believe the plan is for him to take over Toji no Sato Kasasa. But
Mhm.
yeah, so people definitely are learning. There is a desire to learn these skills, but it's been decentralized and it's much more. Um, you have to. Well, there's this story of like Hirata-san who eventually ended up opening the Hawaiian Shochu company in Oahu, and he
Mhm.
basically begged repeatedly to be taken under the wing of the Toji at Manzen, and
Mhm.
it was after being the persistence of several brushbacks that he
Mhm.
was finally taken aboard and allowed to learn the trade before moving off to Hawaii to open a shochu distillery over there. So
Mhm.
you kind of have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and go out there and learn it.
Yeah, absolutely. The and the and even within the shochu makers that we know, for example, when Yamato Zakura, when Tekkan and I collaborated on a black koji expression of Yamato Zakura in 2016, he had never worked with black koji before because Yamato Zakura had been white koji distillery for generations.
Right.
They had not used black since white had arrived on the scene, basically. And so he didn't actually know the appropriate temperature and humidity regulations necessary for black koji.
Right.
Not regulations, but what's going to give him the strongest fermentation, right? Mm-hmm. With the koji propagation. And so he was constantly on the phone with Shinya Nakamura, who works with black koji, to get tips. And he'd call him up. He's like, all right, now it's 34 degrees or 36 degrees Celsius and 70% humidity in my koji room. Is that okay? What do I need to do? You know, and he learned how to make things with black koji just over the phone. with another toji.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely been a shift. The other thing is with this sort of the abandonment of craftsmanship that happened probably in the 60s, 70s, 80s, is I think we're seeing a resurgence. We're seeing more and more young people, or people who become disillusioned with the salaryman life, with the hustle in the big cities, that decide to go back and learn a trade, a traditional craft, and dedicate their lives to it. And I see that with farmers. I see young people taking over their grandparents' farms, you know, leaving the city and going and taking over a farm. You've got people becoming coffee roasters. You've got people becoming leather workers. You've got people becoming potters. And I think the same thing is happening in shochu, where you'll occasionally meet a young man in a distillery who's like, oh yeah, I started last week. You know, I was living in Osaka in a shochu bar, fell in love with it, decided I wanted to learn more. So I came down here and I love what I'm doing, you know? So I think there is going to be a continuation of this traditional craftsmanship going forward, fortunately, because there has been a shift in the mindset among younger Japanese.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully. From your mouth to the Pope's ears. These are definitely the types of. He does? Man,
I don't think he does.
This is these are the types of drinks that we like to we have the most interest in. This obviously small batches is the best batch, and so hopefully a lot more of this continues. Most of the industry, as people probably assume, is really small distilleries, multi-generational family-run distilleries, and we hope that can continue through, you know, people passing down these secrets and the craftsmanship, just the craft nature of the entire enterprise. But there's also going to be the competing interests of very large corporations that want to gobble some of these distilleries up and take control of production, inject some funds, and, you know, bring it up to date, so to speak. And so that's going to be an interesting back and forth, especially as shochu and awamori find some fans overseas, which is beginning to happen. So
yeah, that's wait, and when you say most of the industry, I think you mean by number of distilleries, not by production volume.
Not by volume, no.
Yeah, by volume, it's some of these drinks are very, very hard to find, but most distilleries are still on the small side, the family side. So.
Absolutely.
Now, it's interesting. One thing, and this is maybe even a thing for another episode, but when I went down to, it was when you were interviewing Kurt, and I was at Mori no Kura, something I learned there was that as the other, so Kasatori Shochu, sake lees shochu was being made all throughout that region of Fukuoka, and there were two national brands actually that were made in that region. And when post-war, Kasatori ended up with a very bad reputation. The word itself was basically, it meant like corruption and illegal, like black market sorts of things. It became a slang for that, and people just stopped drinking Kasatori Shochu. And the two distilleries, or the two breweries that were making those two famous brands, actually went out of business and gave the brands to Morinokura. The brand names, all the branding and everything were just given to Morinokura to carry on the legacy, because Morinokura wasn't going out of business, and so they still make those brands under those names from what they were pre-war, which is just sort of, so it's just thinking about consolidation of the industry and what might happen in the future. There is the potential for brands to be taken over by other distilleries if those brands can have a second life. But I never had heard a story like that before, where brands just got passed around as businesses went under.
Wow.
So why don't we talk maybe about Toji no Sato's most popular brand?
Itton, huh?
I saw it behind you, so I thought maybe you could chat a little bit about that.
This fatty right here, Itton is a really, I've always had a kind of a soft spot for it, and it's a very difficult to get bottle of sweet potato shochu, which is like everything else made at the distillery. It's clay pot fermented. It's all handmade koji. But the really interesting thing about the production that we learned, and I had no idea until I asked the Toji point blank, was that in the primary fermentation, it's rice koji. In the secondary fermentation, it's, of course, sweet potatoes and yellow rice koji mixed in there, which I've never heard of before. Have you ever heard of that? Like,
I have not.
Adding a different type of koji rice to the secondary? So that was really interesting.
In the first fermentation, is it white or black?
It's white.
White, okay. Yes, so they start with a white koji fermentation primary, add sweet potatoes and yellow koji,
yellow rice koji.
I guess if you think about it, you get the acidity. You get the acidity from the white koji to protect the fermentation, and then from the yellow koji you get those floral notes, right?
Yeah,
you get so
I think that's probably what they're going for. It has this distinctive, like really rough, twiny type of rope on it. And the only way that you can really get this, unless you go on the secondary market, is by lottery, which Stephen and I both entered everyone in our household into when we were there.
Yeah. We and they do monthly lotteries, but you have to send a postcard to the distillery with the appropriate information on it. And then if you win, you can buy up to 2 bottles. So fingers crossed. Hopefully we win.
Yep. Hopefully we hit it. I will take both bottles very, very happily, and I will drink them with a smile on my face.
No doubt.
Maya's chimed in with something. She's heard of the extra koji. It's called oi koji.
Oi koji.
Other distilleries do that too. I've never heard somebody explain it to me so clearly. I definitely have heard of extra koji going into the secondary fermentation, just not a different strain of koji being used. I think maybe that was the first time I'd seen that. But anyways, thank you, Maya, as always, for comments. And that was a really, really good experience. Have a newfound appreciation for that distillery, and even a more wider and more in-depth appreciation. And I'm glad I was able to finally fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge about the guild. Still have a lot more questions, but that was a good first step, I think.
Definitely. And and it was funny because we did taste through their other products, and I think we both enjoyed the other things that they make. And I was prepared to buy a couple of bottles of the other stuff they made, and then the Toji came out and he said, I have a little bit of Itton available if you guys would like to buy some.
Yeah, we got really lucky. Apparently there was an event or something and they didn't sell through everything. Yeah. Mostly because of COVID restricting people traveling. But we were able to walk out of there with a couple of small bottles of Itton. So
yeah, it was funny when we walked in, there were actually all the big bottles in their boxes sitting on a table right by the cashier. And we were both really excited that, we can buy it today. And then very quickly we realized that those were all actually packaged for shipping to the lottery winners. So it came back around and we ended up getting our bottles. So that was a happy moment. Yeah, but that was a really fun trip. I hope we have other opportunities to do things like that. And Chris Caldwell did ask if we audio record the discussions. And I did do some audio recording. I didn't record while the film crew was filming. Once they turned off their cameras, then I set out my phone and recorded some of the conversation. So we'll actually, we're now planning, as you can imagine, an episode of Japan Distilled podcast about the Kurose Toji, about the guilds, and we'll intersperse some of that audio so you can hear this thick Sansama dialect as they talk about koji fermentation.
You can study Satsuma Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, let's because we're already almost 40 minutes in, let's do a very quick. We're gonna do a throwback here, and this is where we're gonna bring the awamori in that we had mentioned before. We're gonna do a quick shochu rakuen bottle tasting. This is from the B set, and it's from Miyasato Shuzo down in Naha. And this is a place that both Stephen and I have been to. It's not always the easiest distillery to visit because it's such a small crew and their season is somewhat limited. But we're gonna drink this Miyasato Shuzo Sho no. What is this? Yeah, it's a 30% awamori. So we're talking 100% rice, of course. Yep, and this is very much in line with what they do. It's a really delicate fermentation and distillation. 100% black koji, of course. Single pot distilled, and just a really, really pretty, really consistently kind of delicate awamori expression that is very, very well regarded, also very difficult to get your hands on outside of the immediate area. I can only think of like 2 places here in Tokyo where I can reliably find it, and quite popular. This is one of my favorite brands, honestly.
Yeah, me as well. I really like Miyasato and the things they're doing. Here in Fukuoka, they're available at Sumiyoshi Shuhan, which has an outpost in Hakata Station. So if you happen to be in Fukuoka, look for Sumiyoshi. They've got a fun little standing bar in the back of the liquor shop, and they have usually 2 or 3 different Miyasato products.
This has a really nice sweetness to it on the palate. Really, really enjoyable sweetness.
That's beautiful.
Shochu Rakuen. We fell so far behind on this. I still have how many more crates of little boxes of these things? So we got to pump through this.
We do. Yeah, this is the last, I think, of the B set, and I think what does it go to? F maybe.
We're not even halfway through. So one thing I love about this distillery is, number one, is the size, how small it is. When you go in there, they just, in order to do any step of the process of making the awamori, they have to move all of this crap out of the way. Like they've got, they've got their outer shipper cartons that are like all stacked on top of some of the fermenters, and they got to move those in order to transfer this batch into that vessel. And it's a really, really tight, nondescript little distillery that's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. You would never know it's there unless you had found it on a map. And, just a really humble way of doing business back there. And then they just make this really reliably equal parts delicate, but then also surprisingly nuanced in terms of just the waves of flavor and aroma that are present and tightly packed in there. So it's always a crowd pleaser. And their main brand, of course, which we haven't mentioned yet, is called Harusame, Harusame. And I think, Stephen, wasn't that your newly opened, actually?
Yeah, that's right. If we're going to do newly opened, my newly opened is actually
Harusame. That's the brand right there. Yeah. Kari.
So you've probably seen
Kari,
this.
It's a pretty. Anytime people get their hands on it, they put it right up on Instagram. So
yes, pretty packaging. I love the bottle shape.
Kari actually is one way to say Kanpai in the local dialect. So keep that in mind. I guess if it was transliterated, it would be Kari and then hyphen to extend the I. So Kari, and it's. Yeah, anytime you see Harusame on a menu, go ahead and order it because this is nice.
Yep. Yeah, I think I've been able to find 8 and 11-year-old aged Harusame as well, which are absolutely gorgeous. And I just picked up another bottle that comes like really thin. Have you seen that? It's almost I don't.
Yeah, the green
Unfortunately,
one.
it's packed
Is
away
it
in a
green?
box. Not the green one. It's a clear bottle that actually is almost like a really really sharp angled triangle sort of thing,
I
like
haven't.
cone almost.
No.
Yeah, yeah. That was at Sumiyoshi recently, so I picked it up. I haven't tried it yet, but that'll be my newly opened in the future. So yeah, no, but definitely good stuff down there at Miyazato. So good stuff.
Yeah. All right. I'm loving this actually. The this is I love the sweetness on this. I don't know
Yeah,
what is different about this particular expression, but
it's before 11 a.m. maybe.
maybe that's what it is.
Your
Yeah,
your
yeah.
your palate might be more awake.
It could be. This one,
Yeah,
it just for whatever
it's
reason, it has this really, really rich,
hmm
slightly nutty, but then also like candied sweetness to it, almost like a cotton candy type of sweetness that is really surprisingly satisfying. So, hey, good job, Miyazato-san, as usual. Always
yeah.
knocking it out of the park. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this 105th episode of Shochu'sday. Um, we have, I don't know if you've taken the time to listen to them, but I just listened to them last night. The two most recent episodes of Japan Distilled, which are read by, they were produced and written by Steven, and then narrated by Rich Pav. They're really a really good in-depth look at how kura kurabito, somebody who works in the kura, their daily, like every step of the day from
Hmm.
the first episode number 34 is the morning shift, and then episode 35 is the night shift. Episode 36 is in production right now. That's sorry, afternoon shift. The afternoon shift, the night shift is in production right now.
Hmm.
Really, really detailed look at what it smells like, what it feels like to be working the distillery floor. So I highly recommend having a listen to those. They're relatively, I mean, as our episodes go, they're a little bit on the short side. They're about 30 minutes each.
That's
So
right.
a car ride, I think, for both
Yeah,
of them.
the third episode should be out very very soon. I know we haven't fit our usual production schedule, release schedule during these episodes, but the amount of work that Rich is putting into it is amazing. He's really been putting his back into it because he's doing all of the audio editing, he's doing all of the voice work, and he's doing all of the sound effects and music. And it's just taking him hours and hours and hours. And I think he regrets agreeing to do to do it. So hopefully something
It's a
good
fun
comes out of it.
experiment, but we will not be repeating it.
Yeah, and I guess just to his credit, if you guys are looking for another podcast to listen to, his Uncanny Robot podcast is so funny and weird. I highly recommend it. And the amount of work he's putting into these episodes for us is just a fraction of what he does to produce those. They take him days and days and days of work. So
Yeah.
definitely worth giving those a listen. Some of the highest quality audio I've heard in podcasting, honestly.
Yeah.
The audio work
Yep.
is phenomenal. So,
Here's a quick, as we close, quick note from Richard about a symposium on the 28th. If it seems like this one's going to be Japanese language, so
mhm.
if you happen to be interested, then go ahead and look up this Awamori Oyobi Dentoteki Shuzo Sake Tsukuri Symposium. If you are looking to participate on that on the 28th of this month. And that's going to do it for us. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody else who contributed your comments and your attention. Hopefully we made you thirsty wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm very... I don't know. Are you have anything else to say, Stephen? Are we able to sign off here?
Yep. No, I'm good. This is a fun one.
Let's bring it out.
Yeah.
To both of us here in Japan, coming to you live from Fukuoka and Tokyo, to all of you all around the world, a very hearty and heartfelt kanpai.
Kanpai.